Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast, Navigating the Evolving ESG Landscape into 2025. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Madison Poitras, Senior Manager, and Anna Waldren, Senior Manager. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anna to get our presentation started.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. As you heard, my name's Anna Waldren. I'm a Senior Manager at Moss Adams, based in Seattle, if you couldn't tell, and been with the firm for 10 years. I really split my time between doing your regular vanilla financial statement audits and reviews and working in our ESG assurance department. Really looking forward to having an hour with you all today just to talk a little bit about what the ESG landscape looks like and how you can take some of that proactively into 2025. And I'm joined with Madison today.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Madison Poitras. I'm an ESG Senior Manager, part of our Moss Adams Consulting Group within our Strategy and Operations practice. My background really has been focused in ESG within a variety of industries related to ESG regulatory compliance, reporting with ESG frameworks, internal controls over ESG data, and just overall ESG strategy. And with that, we're really excited for this agenda today. We're going to start off with our ESG regulatory update. We're going to go into ESG voluntary reporting. We're going to also talk through trends and challenges specifically related to preparing for 2025. And then we're going to wrap up with benefits of being proactive, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A at the end of today's session. So underscoring our agenda, here are our learning objectives for today. So we really hope you come away from this webinar today understanding key takeaways and implications from the California climate bills, specifically SB 261 and SB 253, as well as the SEC climate disclosure rule and the EU CSRD. So you will learn about the factors driving voluntary ESG reporting, including the importance of CSR reports and public pledges for voluntary measures that your organization are trying to achieve. And we're aiming to also equip you with the essential steps for enhancing ESG compliance and the business case for proactive engagement in ESG strategies. Finally, we will discuss trends in the ESG regulatory landscape and their impacts on organizational reporting, as well as stakeholder engagement. But before all that good stuff, I'm going to pass it over to Chad for our first polling question.
All right, thanks, Madison. We have our first polling question of the day. What brought you to today's session? Either A, to learn about ESG regulations, B, to learn about ESG voluntary reporting, C, to understand ESG trends, D, all of the above. So if you select the answer on your screen and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded today. You need to answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions to receive your CPE credit. And we'll give you about 10 seconds here or so to answer this one.
I'm guessing it's going to be a mix of all of the above and ESG regulations, but just my best guess. We will see.
All right, a couple more seconds here.
We didn't give you an option of just CPE. You have to be interested in ESG for this session.
All right, let's check out the results.
All right, my guess was right. It looks like predominantly all of the above, with a second place to learn about ESG regulations, which is a great segue into our next section. So the ESG regulation update. We're going to start with the SEC Climate Disclosure Rule. So to give everyone some background on this rule, this was originally proposed by the SEC in March of 2022. On March 6th of this year, the SEC issued the final rule. The final rule will require information about a registrant's climate-related risks that have materially impacted or reasonably likely to have a material impact on its business strategy, results of operations, or financial condition. The final rule does leverage some concepts from the disclosure framework developed by the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail soon, and which is also the basis for new mandatory reporting requirements in the US and globally. We did want to know, as many of you do know, the SEC voluntarily stayed the effective date of the final rule. So the outcome of the litigation is unknown at this point in time, and the review may take several months or longer. Maybe we'll have an update in January. It is really uncertain right now if the SEC will retain or extend the final rule's current compliance dates, or if the rule will get completely revoked entirely. But with that, it's still important to understand kind of why it was brought by the SEC board to registrants. So here is a high-level summary. Applicability, this rule does apply to all registrants, including EGCs, SRCs, and FPIs. The location of the required disclosures are included in registration statements as well as annual reports. There is a huge materiality qualifier throughout this rule, meaning materiality is defined as it is used in the US Supreme Court's definition, which is, quote, a matter is material if there is substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider it important when determining whether to buy or sell securities or how to vote. The compliance dates, as they're currently written in the rule, are dependent on the registrant's filer status as well as the type of disclosure. So as the rule is currently written, the rules will be phased in starting in your FYB. FYB stands for your fiscal year beginning in the calendar year listed of 2025 for large accelerated filers. So that gives you a high-level summary. Here's a snapshot of the rule, which is just the main themes of this rule, including the SK requirements as well as the SX requirements. So starting with that first bullet point there, which are climate-related goals and targets and material climate-related risks that have had or reasonably likely to have a material impact on the organization's business strategy, results of operations, or financial conditions. That next bullet point are activities to mitigate or adapt to a material climate-related risk. This includes quantitative as well as qualitative descriptions. And then we have board oversight of climate-related risks, which are any role that management might play in assessing and managing these material climate-related risks. This is a really hot topic right now. A lot of the organizations that we talk to, they're being asked questions from their board of, hey, do we have, material climate-related risks? Do we have an ESG strategy in place? So we're seeing more and more of that board involvement and management's role in assessing and managing these types of risks. And then that second to last bullet point, we have material. So there's that materiality qualifier that I was referencing for scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emission disclosures for large accelerated filers and accelerated filers that aren't otherwise exempted. So a big change from the proposed rule was, scope 3 was originally included. You can see that scope 3 has been now scrapped. There were a lot of public concerns and comments around scope 3 related to indirect implications to private organizations being in public companies' value chain. So they did remove scope 3 and added that materiality qualifier. And then we have, last but not least, financial statement disclosures, which in summary are the effects of severe weather events and other natural conditions related to your costs and losses. So I keep saying climate related, risks. What does this actually mean? And this will help us throughout our webinar today. So physical risks and transition risks are the two types of climate related risks that are mostly defined in this marketplace. Physical risks, you can think of acute and chronic risks. Acute being short-term severe weather events such as hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and wildfires, while chronic risks are longer-term weather patterns such as sustained higher temperatures, sea level rise, and drought. And then you have that other branch of transition risks. So I like to think of transition risks as transitioning to a low carbon economy. So an example of this would be reduced market demand for a carbon intensive product. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a flavor for what are climate related risks. And now we're going to jump into the California climate bills. So starting with California SB 253, this is also known as the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. So SB 253 will require any public or private company earning over $1 billion in annual revenue that has California operations to publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions released from their operations and their supply chain. So subject companies will need to measure and report these greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is kind of the gold standard of carbon accounting. So comparing this to the SEC rule, you can see that scope 3 included and there is no materiality qualifier present. So it's really important to understand, the different regulations, how they impact you and the different compliance requirements. And for those that aren't familiar, with carbon accounting, greenhouse gas emissions, we have defined what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are, starting with scope 1, which are direct emissions from the organization's owned or controlled sources. So examples of this would be boilers, furnaces, turbines. Scope 2 are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. And then scope 3 are all indirect emissions not included in scope 2, to avoid double counting in the value chain of the reporting company. And with that, we're going to jump into the timelines for SB 253. So as many of you recall, when Newsom signed these two bills into law in October of 2023, he questioned whether the implementation deadlines in the bills were actually feasible. And as a result, Newsom signed SB 219 on September 27th, which was a couple of months ago at this point, which included a series of amendments to SB 253 as well as to Senate Bill 261. So the compliance dates for initial reporting remained intact for both SB 253 and SB 261, with only an extension noted for CARB, which is the California Air Resource Board, to adopt these implementing regulations. So as of now, this act will require all applicable companies to disclose their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions starting in 2026, so not far away at all. And that data will be from your fiscal year 2025. However, SB 219 did include slightly easing scope 3 emissions reporting timing, which will still begin in 2027, but rather than being required within 180 days after disclosure of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, it will now be done to a schedule specified by CARB. So entities will need to submit their emissions information to an emissions reporting organization that will be designated by CARB. The organization will develop a publicly accessible digital platform for the emissions data to be submitted. There are assurance requirements included for these emissions. So scope 1 and scope 2 emissions shall be performed at a limited assurance level beginning in 2026 and at a reasonable assurance level beginning in 2030. So if CARB does decide that scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions should be assured, a requirement for limited assurance would also begin in 2030. So I do want to note the amended law SB 219 also allows climate reporting to be consolidated at the parent company level, and it also no longer requires companies to pay fees upon filing their disclosure. And then really hot off the press, a new enforcement notice went out on December 5th last week. In this notice, CARB noted they will exercise its enforcement discretion, including allowing companies to report Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the first year based on data, and this is a quote, that can be determined from information the reporting entity already possesses or is already collecting, as long as the companies are demonstrating good faith efforts to comply with the new law. So additionally, CARB added that it won't take enforcement action for incomplete reporting in that first year, again, as long as the companies make good faith effort to retain all data relevant to emissions reporting for the entity's prior fiscal year. So this is really new. There will be more to come as this was a very recent update. So we are expecting a little more clarity around this enforcement notice and what this means in actual practice. So what does this mean for your upcoming, 2025 for entities that are applicable? It means if you haven't started calculating your carbon footprint, you will want to get started. And ideally, if you have never calculate your FY 2024 data, have a readiness assessment over that data, identify your gaps, make recommendations so that your emission calculations are stronger for your 2025 submitted data. The first year is always the hardest, and then it gets better and better with each year as you get used to data collection and understand, estimates versus primary data needs. And with that, we're going to jump into the next California climate bill, which is SB 261. This is known as the Climate-Related Financial Risk Act, which will require companies with greater than $500 million in annual revenue and are doing business in California to prepare biennial reports disclosing climate-related financial risks and describing measures adopted to mitigate and adapt to that risk. So companies with over 500 million in annual revenue, that revenue applicability is determined based on the entity's revenue from the prior fiscal year, the same as it is for SB 253. And that bill will require on or before January 1st of 2026 and every 2 years thereafter to prepare a climate-related financial risk report. So this bill would require the covered entity to make a copy of that report available to the public on its own website. And in regards to reporting your climate-related financial risks, this bill notes reporting in accordance with that TCFD framework that I mentioned. So now you already understand, climate-related risks. Those were the physical and transition risks that I talked through earlier, and seeing that theme in this California Senate bill as well. And taking a little bit more of a deeper dive on this TCFD framework, this slide here shows the 4 core elements of this framework, starting with governance, then moving to strategy, risk management, and lastly, metrics and targets. So these 4 core elements are interrelated and are supported by 11 recommended disclosures that build out this framework with information that should help investors and other stakeholders understand how reporting organizations think about and assess climate-related risks and opportunities. So a key element of this framework is the consistent categorization of climate-related risks and opportunities. So we have a good handle on the risks. Let's talk through some climate-related opportunities. These will vary depending on the region, market, and industry in which an organization operates. The task force identified several areas of opportunity, including resource efficiency, energy source, products and services, and markets. So for example, using resource efficiency as an opportunity, improving your resource efficiency, such as reducing water or minimizing waste generation and energy consumption, can lead to cost savings and enhanced operational performance. So the TCFD's view is improvements in resource efficiency can reduce operating costs and decrease exposure to erratic resource prices, while also contributing to emission reduction goals. And one final comment prior to passing it, to EU CSRD regulation. We've been asked a lot lately, what do we think will happen in 2025 for these types of climate regulations? And my personal opinion is that we will see less activity at the federal level, but we will continue to see more activity at the state level. So California started with these climate rules, but other states are following their lead, such as Washington, Minnesota, Illinois, and New York. And there is undoubtedly a ripple effect around these climate-related disclosures, influencing the scale and complexity of the data coming out of this regulatory landscape. And with that, I'll pass it over to Anna to talk through CSRD.
All right, thank you, Maddie. Okay, so Maddie covered some of the kind of heavy hitting regulations in the United States, but there are jurisdictions globally that are also looking at putting in sustainability reporting regulations. So some countries of note that are currently working on developing their regulations would be Japan, China, Singapore, and Brazil. That's just to name a few. There's quite a few that are looking into this. However, as it stands today, the primary regulation on a global scale that's having impact on US-based businesses is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. So CSRD was signed into law in January 2023. It's actually replacing an existing directive known as the NFRD, or the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. While CSRD is replacing the NFRD, it's really broadening the scope, both of which companies are needing to report under this directive, as well as the type of information that's included in the directive. So the purpose of CSRD is to increase the transparency and accountability of large companies in the European Union, and is requiring them to publish annual detailed reports on their environmental and social impacts in order that investors and stakeholders have better information to evaluate a company's performance. And just because you're a US-based company doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of scope for this requirement. The types of companies that are in scope for CSRD is dependent on the number of employees you have, the value of the assets on your balance sheet, as well as your annual revenue turnover. And even if you're a US-based company, if you have operations in the EU, have an EU office, or have an EU subsidiary, it's possible that you would be in scope for this reporting. It's a pretty comprehensive reporting directive. So if there's a potential that you may be in scope, we highly, highly recommend that you take a look at that now and can take steps towards being in compliance if you do think you'll be in scope. In addition to sort of buckets of companies that will be in scope for this directive, there's also a waterfall timeline of when those companies will need to adopt the standards. The first batch of companies that are applying CSRD are large EU companies that are listed on the regulated EU markets and were previously subject to NFRD. Those companies will actually be publishing their first reports in 2025, and that'll be based on the financial year 2024 information. So essentially, CSRD is already in effect for those companies. And then there's a 5-year waterfall where other companies that are in scope that are smaller will start to adopt. Another item to note for CSRD is that there is a mandatory assurance requirement. So these annual reports that companies will be publishing do need to receive third-party assurance over the information in those reports. And a really fundamental principle of CSRD is the concept of double materiality. And double materiality requires businesses to measure and report sustainability issues from both an impact perspective and a financial perspective. So when we talk about financial materiality, that's really emphasizing how external ESG risks and opportunities have an impact financially on the company. And then impact materiality is looking at the effect that a company's operations have on its environment and society. And so in order to determine which items are material to your organization from both a financial and impact perspective, companies are required to perform a double materiality assessment. And then another critical component of CSRD is what we refer to as ESRS, which is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So this is a detailed framework that was developed that companies must follow in order to comply with CSRD. So the ESRSs are the specific guidelines on how to report sustainability information. And then CSRD is the mandate that companies have to report their sustainability information. So the ESRSs are sort of the how-to guide for meeting the CSRD requirements. You'll see there's 12 standards that make up the ESRSs. The first two are general requirements and general disclosures, and then each of the last 10 are specific topics. So things like climate change, pollution, workforce, business conduct. Rolling up to each of those standards is hundreds of potential KPIs and metrics that could be reported in a company's sustainability report under CSRD. So companies need to apply their double materiality assessment to determine which of those hundreds of metrics and KPIs are actually material to their organization and will need to be disclosed and reported on in their annual report. So this is a pretty involved standard. Unlike the SEC ruling, it does cover both social elements and environmental elements. And so we're encouraging clients that may be in scope for this to get started on the process now, even if your adoption date is a few years out. We are working with some US-based companies that have EU operations, and right now they're really in the performing their double materiality assessment phase, bringing us in to give assurance over that assessment so that they can move forward to the next step of actually reporting on those material KPIs. And before we move on to our next topic, we'll take a quick pause here for a polling question.
All right, thanks, Anna. And our second polling question of the day: is your organization subject to any of the ESG regulations discussed today? Either A, California Climate Rule SB 253, B, California Climate Rule SB 261, C, CSRD, D, SEC Climate Rule, or E, one or more of the above regulations. So if you select the answer on your screen and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded. I'll give you about 5 to 10 seconds to answer this one.
And we may have made this a little hard if you aren't subject to any of the regulations, which is definitely possible. If that's the case, I would say maybe put E or pick one that you think is the most interesting. I'm guessing this audience is a mix of people that are subject, but probably also quite a few companies that maybe aren't in scope for these regulations yet, but just trying to learn more.
All right, let's check out the results.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I'm guessing the E is a combination, probably some companies that are applicable for multiple of these, but also probably a lot of people that maybe aren't subject to any specific regulations yet, but wanting to learn more as they kind of see a trend here of increasing regulation and change. Okay, so that leads to our next topic. So as I was mentioning, I would expect a good portion of this audience maybe isn't subject to any of the regulations that we've talked about today. You may not be a $1 billion or $500 million company that has operations in California. Maybe you're in a public company or you don't have EU operations. So for the next part of the presentation, we wanted to talk a little bit about how your company can still engage with ESG reporting, and also what the benefits are of doing some voluntary sustainability disclosures. So I've been working in the ESG assurance space for a little over 9 years, and you may have noticed on the regulations that we were just talking about, those have primarily come about in the last 3 years or so. And so there's been a long period where companies have, absent of regulations, just been voluntarily reporting out sustainability related information to their stakeholders, and even taking that next step of voluntarily getting third-party assurance over the information that they're reporting. When you are doing voluntary reporting, there's a lot of different avenues that reporting can take. And so we've listed a few that we most commonly see here, but really it's it's a really wide range of venues that this information gets to stakeholders. Probably the most common form that I run into is the CSR, or corporate social responsibility reports. These are also commonly referred to as sustainability reports. This would be a report a company is publishing on its website, maybe annually or biannually, that is separate from its financial information and including information on metrics and activities related to their social and environmental efforts. Companies can also enroll in the SBTI program and set science-based targets and then report out to the public on their progress against those SBTI goals. I'll talk a little bit more on the Carbon Disclosure Project on the next slide, but the CDP is the largest repository for companies to voluntarily report their greenhouse gas emissions. We also see a lot of companies setting UN Sustainability Development Goals and reporting against those SDGs out to their stakeholders. The ISO 14064 is an international standard that helps organizations measure and manage and report on their greenhouse gas emissions. EcoVadis is a global provider of corporate sustainability ratings, so companies can engage in their sustainability rating program. And then we also see companies striving for a B Corporation certification, which is a designation that a business is meeting a high standard of verified environmental and social performance, accountability, and transparency. So if you are not subject to a reporting regulation for sustainability, it can be a really big struggle to know, what information you're going to report out on a voluntary basis. Sometimes it's nice when you have a regulation that is very clearly outlining the standards that you need to follow, where you need to report, when you need to report. If you're wading into the world of voluntary reporting, you don't have as prescriptive guidance for what information and where you're going to report that information. And so out of that sort of uncertainty came the world of voluntary reporting frameworks. And this has been evolving over the last couple of decades, but we've listed some of the bigger names here. The TCFD framework, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is what Maddie was talking about as the basis for some of those US-based regulations. I also mentioned the CDP on the previous slide. The CDP has a really straightforward process that a lot of companies like. So for the CDP, they publish an annual questionnaire that companies can fill out and submit to the CDP and then receive back a grade based on the responses and their disclosures. But what I really wanted to highlight here is the ISSB. So the ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's the sister board to the IASB, which if you're in the accounting world, you'll know is the International Accounting Standards Board. Both of those report up to the IFRS Foundation, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. Sorry, it's an alphabet soup for sure of acronyms in this space, but the IFRS Foundation gave the ISSB a directive to create essentially the first set of global standards for sustainability reporting. And so in June 2023, the ISSB published their first two standards, which are the IFRS S1, which covers general requirements for sustainability-related disclosures, and then the IFRS S2, which is climate-related disclosures specifically. And similar to the ESRSs, they'll continue to work on creating additional standards that cover different topics like biodiversity or employee workforce. But because climate-related disclosures is a hot topic, that was their first priority for getting a standard out. And the ISSB, kind of in the spirit of having these be the global set of standards, has slowly been collaborating and taking over these other voluntary reporting frameworks. So in 2022, the ISSB did assume responsibility for the SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They also started overseeing the TCFD framework and work really closely with the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. Additionally, for 2024, this was the first year that the CDP's questionnaire actually incorporated the IFRS S2 standard from the ISSB. So while the ISSB standards are voluntary, we do see different jurisdictions and countries starting to adopt these standards and make them mandatory for their constituents. So there's countries that have expressed that they are going to require these, others that are kind of incorporating elements of the standard into their own regulations that they're building. So it's been a little bit of the Wild West the last 10 or plus years in the voluntary reporting framework, but I'd say in the last couple of years, we see a bit of a march towards a more standardized kind of global set of standards, and the ISSB is really leading that charge. And I do think that's a good thing for users of these reports. It's nice for stakeholders to be able to kind of compare apples to apples, whereas before comparing companies that were reporting under different frameworks could result in kind of a challenging comparison. And also wanted to touch on a little bit of the benefits of voluntarily building in a sustainability lens to your business. I kind of view the bottom line of the business case for viewing your business through a sustainability lens is that you create a company that's really resilient to those sustainability related risks and able to capitalize and be responsive on the opportunities that are present. So by including sustainability in your risk assessment process, you're able to more effectively evaluate climate related risks to your company, your suppliers, and your competitors. On the financial statement audit side of my day job, I work with a lot of government accounting reporters, specifically ports and airports. So I immediately thought of shipping companies as kind of an example of this. We see some shipping companies proactively identifying potential disruptions caused by extreme weather, for example, the Suez Canal obstruction in 2021. And actually developing contingency plans with alternate routes that minimize the impact to business so that they can be more dynamic to those potential climate risks. Additionally, if you're building in sustainability to your capital allocation planning, you're able to make better informed decisions on where and when you're allocating your capital. You're also able to do things like access green bonds or green loans potentially, or investing in equipment that will reduce your carbon footprint in the long term. Sustainability strategic planning lets you evaluate risks and exposures and kind of categorize those based on short, medium, and long term. I think a good example of how this can look would be a gas company that's using strategic planning to prioritize their risks. They would identify a short-term risk maybe as immediate impacts from extreme weather. A medium risk could be potential disruption from changing consumer demand towards more renewable energy. And then they may prioritize a long-term risk related to long-term impacts from climate change on their oil and gas operations. And then a final benefit we wanted to call out is getting a competitive advantage in the market and appealing to your stakeholders. A company that stands out to me as having done a good job of this is Patagonia. They're an outdoor apparel company. They're known for their strong commitment to environmentally responsible practices, and as a result, have a very loyal customer following. And I will pass it back to Chad for our next polling question.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And our third polling question of the day, how does your organization currently approach voluntary ESG reporting? Either A, we have a comprehensive strategy in place. B, we are in the early stages of development. C, we do not currently engage in voluntary reporting. Or D, we primarily focus on mandatory reporting only, but plan to engage in voluntary reporting in future years. If you just select the answer on your screen and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded today, and we'll give you about 5 to 10 seconds to answer this one.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for those results, I saw a couple of questions come in that I quickly wanted to answer. One was, what about for private companies? Are there any requirements in develop? So those two California Senate bills, SB 253 and SB 261, are applicable to private organizations. So the applicability specifically for SB 253 is private or public with California operations with over $1 billion in annual revenue, while SB 261 is private or public with annual revenue over 500 million. So those two climate regs are applicable to private organizations. And with that, I think I'll give it back to Chad and I'll answer some more questions towards the end of our session today.
Awesome. Thanks, Madison. And let's check out the results to the third polling question.
All right, looks like we have a mix. It seems like most of our audience does not currently engage in voluntary reporting. So the, must-haves versus, in nice-to-haves is kind of at play here. And with that, I think that's a good segue into our next section, which is ESG trends and challenges in the space today and things to be aware of if regulations and voluntary reporting are part of your 2025 plan or any future plans. So with that, we're going to first talk about data availability and quality. So this is probably the biggest challenge we see: access to reliable and consistent climate-related or ESG-related data. It is really one of the most significant challenges organizations face in their ESG efforts. Many organizations struggle to really gather comprehensive data on their emissions or resource usage and other sustainability metrics, which is really essential for compliance with some of these regulations and effective voluntary reporting. So many organizations do not have a system of record for their ESG data, so the quality of the data can be questionable without those proper access internal controls in place. Alternatively, many companies may have siloed data systems, making it difficult to aggregate and analyze the necessary information effectively. As this can be, new reporting for many organizations, I think the polling question results show that many folks aren't doing this. So the first time doing it, oftentimes it's really hard to obtain that data needed internally within your organization or externally from vendors or partners within your supply chain. So without fresh data, there is an increased reliance on estimates or outdated data, which can lead to inaccuracies, specifically in emissions reporting, which could undermine credibility and hurt your reputation as an organization. So how do you combat this trend and this challenge? Encouraging to implement robust data management practices, including regular audits and validation processes to enhance the reliability of that ESG data or emissions data. This really shows to your stakeholders, your data quality is strong and your claims can hold up to scrutiny. Consider investing in technology and softwares that facilitate better data management collection. This may include software solutions for tracking emissions into also integrating into different data across departments. So we also encourage the development of standardized process for data collection, ensuring that all relevant teams are aligned and that data is consistently reported. So in conclusion, for 2025, we encourage organizations to consider their own data management practices and explore opportunities for improvement as they navigate this evolving ESG landscape, whether that's meeting your ESG regulatory compliance requirements or have success in voluntary reporting. Next, we have cross-functional collaboration. So why is there a need for collaboration when it comes to ESG reporting? So ESG reporting is not just the responsibility of the sustainability team. It really does involve multiple stakeholders across the organization. Each department brings unique expertise and insights that are essential for comprehensive reporting. So for example, you look at the finance department, they provide data on financial implications and they support the connection between climate-related risk and financial impacts, like those SX requirements within the SEC climate rule. You look at risk management, which identifies potential ESG-related risks, whether that's your second line, your enterprise risk management function, maybe it's your third line and internal audit incorporating these types of risks into their audit universe, or risk appetite statements. And then you have sustainability and operations departments. So operations, supply data on resource usage and operational practices that can affect emissions, energy usage, waste management, other operations that can have that environmental impact. So it's really important to foster effective communication and coordination among these diverse groups. So to foster this type of effective communication, you can create steering committees or leadership governance groups, which are made up of these different departments to ensure that information isn't siloed to one group. It's important to meet frequently enough so information isn't disaggregated and departments aren't operating independently without sharing that critical data or insights that could enhance your ESG reporting. So typically we see these type of committees meeting on a quarterly basis with a supporting charter and diverse team members from these different departments to build this effective ESG or sustainability strategy. One other thing to note, part of cross-functional collaboration is related to training and capacity building. So including training employees from different departments on ESG principles and reporting requirements. This can help build that shared understanding and commitment to sustainability goals, considering workshops or seminars that bring together representatives from various departments to discuss these ESG challenges and brainstorm the solutions collaboratively. All right, and now we're going to get to materiality assessments. So we wanted to spend some time on this trend and challenge as it comes up very often and is used in different ways in the ESG space today. So this term of materiality. So today we're going to focus on ESG materiality for this slide from the perspective of ESG reporting, which is in summary, understanding ESG topics that are deemed important or material to your entity's operations by your stakeholders. So material ESG topics will be different for each organization based on the entity's operations, services provided, location, and many other factors. It's really an important process in relation to when you are preparing your ESG strategy and an initial step in ESG reporting. So you can see a lot of these materiality assessments in practice in many organizations' public CSR reports that Anna was talking about. So typically in one of those public CSR report, you can look at one of the first sections of that CSR report and see a dedicated section and how that organization gathered those material topics, usually via a survey. So this is really described as one of the first starting points of an organization's ESG strategy, because it really gives them a direction to focus on what opportunities and risks are key on those main stakeholder groups. And then really quick here, I want to note the different terms of materiality used in the ESG arena. So for example, we're talking about materiality assessments in this slide here as it relates to ESG reporting. But when I was referencing the SEC climate rule, that relies on the US Supreme Court's definition of materiality as it relates to an investor. Those different frameworks that Anna was talking about, you have GRI, which also relies on what we call impact materiality. EU CSRD is double materiality. The IFRS ISSB also has a similar definition used by the IASB, which is traditional view of materiality as it relates in securities law and regulation. So for 2025, it's important, one, to capture your stakeholder feedback so your ESG strategy and initiatives are valuable to your organization. But two, it's important to understand this term of materiality and make sure you're using it appropriately based on what you're trying to achieve, whether that's regulatory compliance or voluntary reporting. All right, next we have integration with financial reporting, which we're really seeing as a trend and also a challenge in the space today. So we continue to see an increasing importance placed on this integration of climate specifically related disclosures with existing reporting frameworks. There is a growing recognition that ESG factors can significantly impact financial performance. So this recognition has increased the number of stakeholders that expect companies to demonstrate how their ESG initiatives align with their overall business strategy. So this trend has encouraged organizations to integrate ESG considerations into their core operations and reporting processes. So this integration really does provide that holistic view of an organization's performance and sustainability efforts, which is why we're continuing to see a push in this area from a voluntary reporting standpoint as well. And it's obviously the basis for California Senate Bill 261 and the SEC climate rule. So this is how do we combat this challenge? This is where utilizing industry accepted metrics and frameworks is really helpful. So many organizations adopt frameworks such as the TCFD or SASB or the ISSB IFRS standards, really to guide their disclosures and ensure they are relevant to investors and overall financial reporting. So for 2025, if you have sustainability or ESG initiatives in place, think about how that relates overall to your financial reporting and implications. And then we have resource intensity. So obviously, this is a lot. So implementing ESG reporting requirements can be resource intensive, right? It demands substantial time, effort, expertise, and financial investment from these organizations. So many organizations lack these necessary resources, including personnel and technology, to really effectively collect and report ESG data. So specifically for smaller organizations or those with limited resources really face unique challenges in meeting these ESG reporting requirements. They may struggle to allocate the necessary resources to help develop and maintain robust ESG disclosures. Many folks that we talk to, we are not talking to a sustainability, even one team member. Usually we're talking to the CFO, we're talking to a financial reporting controller, or we're talking to the VP of internal audit, and they have been tasked now with this ESG strategy or this new regulatory compliance for their organization. So for 2025, consider your budget for your regulatory compliance needs and or voluntary reporting. Other options to kind of help alleviate resource constraints, leverage partnerships, collaborate with industry groups or consultants that can provide that expertise and resources to support your ESG reporting efforts. Focus on materiality. So prioritize reporting on the most material ESG relevant topics to your business. This can help streamline your efforts and allocate resources more effectively. You don't need to boil the ocean, but simply focus on those material topics and don't try to do too much at once. And then one last tool to kind of combat resource intensity are publicly available resources. So regulatory bodies and industry organizations often provide resources and guidelines and tools to assist companies in meeting ESG reporting requirements. And these are free to download, these are free to watch. There's a lot of good information out there. The Greenhouse Gas Protocols example has so much good free data that you can use to really understand what a carbon footprint is and how to calculate it. And these resources can really help alleviate some of the burdens associated with compliance and voluntary reporting as well. And with that, we are on to our fourth polling question. Chad, over to you.
All right, thank you, Madison. Our fourth polling question of the day: what is the biggest challenge your organization faces in ESG reporting? Their lack of data availability, B, engaging stakeholders effectively, C, integrating ESG into business strategy, or D, cost and resource availability. So if you select the answer on your screen and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded. We'll give you about 5 to 10 seconds to answer this one.
I'd say from my perspective, Maddie, probably A and D is what we talk about the most with our clients and kind of see as an obstacle.
Yeah, I'm expecting D is going to be the winner here. But yeah, I think A is going to be a close second from what we see in the space today. I think for a lot of, organizations, this is new. So there's a lot of different challenges to pick from.
Yeah, another challenge not on here is trying to do calculations in Excel. That can be another big challenge here.
Yes, that's where the softwares come into effect. All right, I am on my game with the guessing today. So number one, cost and resource availability, and number two, lack of data availability. So hopefully some of my tips will help with, combating those, but obviously you can always reach out with any questions and we're more than happy to take those offline as well. With that, I'll pass it over to Anna. Thank you.
All right, we're in the home stretch here. We wanted to close out just with talking about why we see benefit in companies being proactive with their ESG reporting and strategy. So you may be in scope for some of those regulations that we talked about at the beginning of this, but they might not be applicable for you for several years, or maybe you don't have any pending regulations that you think your company will be in scope for. We still would recommend and see a lot of value in you being proactive in moving your ESG strategy forward. In general, we've seen over the last few years just a global shift in the business world of accepting that there are strategic and business benefits in having a robust ESG reporting program. That's primarily driven by a growing demand for ESG data from stakeholders and investors. sort of an acceptance that there's a good amount of information about a business that isn't captured just in their financial performance alone, and a heightened use of non-financial data by investors and stakeholders when they're making investment or business decisions. Also see just a growing environment of increasing policy and environmental regulation, and don't see that trend going away, expecting just increased regulation over time. One other thing we wanted to comment on to be thinking through, just because you aren't necessarily in scope for any of the upcoming regulations, there is a component of companies that are in scope for some of those regulations will need to report their Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions incorporate a company's full supply chain. So if you are a supplier to a company that is tracking their greenhouse gas emissions, you may be getting notices from those customers saying, we are requiring that you report to us your greenhouse gas emissions. We've got a lot of clients that reached out when Microsoft moved forward with a supplier requirement to report greenhouse gas emissions, and we expect that additional companies will be moving forward with similar kind of mandates for their suppliers. We've listed some additional benefits here of being proactive in your ESG reporting. We see the opportunity to enhance your risk management practices, essentially identifying and mitigating potential environmental and social risks before they're escalated. Proactive ESG reporting does foster greater investor confidence, and we do see stakeholders increasingly asking for non-financial data. You want to be aligned with regulatory alignment or with regulatory requirements, as well as anticipating future regulations, building up your long-term resilience, capitalizing on competitive advantages, and building that stakeholder engagement. Two other quick comments I wanted to make as it relates to being proactive on your reporting. Madison alluded to this a little bit previously, but greenhouse gas emissions data. So each of the upcoming regulatory requirements that we discussed this morning does include an element of reporting greenhouse gas emissions. Maddie and I will both tell you the first year that you do that calculation, it is burdensome. It takes much longer than you anticipate. You run into issues. So you really don't want the first year that you're doing this calculation to be the year that you need to report out and get regulatory scrutiny on your responses. So we do really recommend giving yourself a year or two buffer to run through the calculation ahead of when you're forced to adopt regulations, bringing in an outside provider to give a greenhouse gas readiness assessment, get some feedback on how you can strengthen your internal controls. Just make sure you're really prepared for that scrutiny when you do need to report out publicly. Also wanted to note on board oversight. So both the SEC Climate Disclosure Rule and Senate Bill 261 have required disclosures around board level oversight. And building up the ESG or sustainability expertise on your board is not something that happens overnight. That's something you need to work at, and setting up committees and making sure you have the appropriate governance structure over your ESG and sustainability reporting takes time and is really critical. So making sure you're working towards those regulatory requirements. Wanted to note that Moss Adams does engage with ESG reporting in a number of ways. My area of expertise is really in that third-party assurance over ESG KPIs, reporting metrics. We also have a group that Maddie leads that can help with greenhouse gas emissions calculations, doing those double materiality assessments, working through readiness assessments, just helping you prepare for upcoming regulations or other requirements that you're bumping into. We are unfortunately at our time, so we won't be able to cover any additional Q&A, but please feel free to send in questions. You've also got Maddie and I's contact information. So happy to connect, to have a call, talk through any questions you have or help where needed. But really appreciate everyone joining us today, and I will turn it over to you, Chad.
All right. Thank you, Anna and Madison, for a great presentation today. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certification is available for download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.